Warning, the following podcast contains massive spoilers. If you haven't seen Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra yet, and don't mind spoilers, hopefully this podcast will inspire you to watch along with us. Now let's begin. Hello, welcome to Beyond Bending, a show about a bunch of millennials analyzing an animated kids show, Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm your host, Marilyn Chanthala, and today's special guest I have...
Hi, I'm Joanna Ordoñez.
Hello, I'm Anthony Joco.
And they are my housemates and longtime friends.
What?
I'm your friend.
Oh my god, I hope so. So, I've been thinking about, actually, it didn't take me long to think about making this podcast. I thought about it and I was like, yeah, that's so obvious. I should really make this podcast. And then once I told people, I was like, hey, I want to make this podcast where we just talk about Avatar. And everyone that I've talked with has been like, oh, fuck yeah.
So needed.
Yeah, and I would tell them all of my ideas and all of these things that I do want to talk about, and how watching it as a teenager, we don't really think about all of the themes and the different layers of the show.
Yeah.
And as adults now, it's like, holy shit, they went through so much. There's so many things going on. Every time I'm talking to people about the show, they're like, oh, and then you can also include this. And they go off on so many ideas.
Yeah.
Our friend Brian can't wait to talk about how he hates firebenders and that they're cheaters. And then you had a bunch of great ideas too.
So, in rewatching the first two episodes, it's been really interesting because I've seen the entire series. I've also seen the Korra series and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Looking back on it or rewatching it with the purpose of discussing it in this podcast is so interesting. Because again, when you're a teen, you pick it up and you're like, oh, it's a cute love story of these kids just trying to end a freaking war. You pick up on a lot of things that are so much more meaningful because as we've grown, we notice how we see ourselves mirrored in these characters through their arcs. So I'm really excited to talk about the first two episodes.
Yeah, same here. Especially since it's been so long since I've watched these episodes. I barely remember anything that happened in the pilot and the second episode. And honestly, I never finished. Avatar.
No.
I never finished it. I only got to... What was the last one we watched? The book...
Maybe Fire.
Yeah, and then I fell off after that. But
Anthony.
Even so, I know the general... Going back and seeing everything with clear eyes, sure. It's still really surprising exactly how much we missed.
Yeah, when you watch it with that intention, it just opens up so many more doors for discussion.
Yeah.
Right? And when you brought up that you were going to do the podcast, everybody was like, there were so many things you can focus on and talk about. Our friend Mark was talking about martial arts, right? And how rooted it is in real martial arts. And how you could go on a whole episode about that. So I hope that happens in the future.
And we've also experienced life. And, compared to when we were teenagers and now, 10 years since the end of the series and where we are now, especially with Netflix announcing the live adaptation. And we are going to talk about that god-awful M. Night Shyamalan's live adaptation movie.
Yeah. I think it was just, there was so much expectation for it because people who watched the show really loved the show.
Yeah.
And then to watch that adaptation just, one, whitewash the characters, which is really upsetting, but then also the creative license that he took with it.
A lot of people, after watching the movie, a lot of claims were like, oh, he only watched an episode or two of the show or whatever, right? And so he didn't have an understanding of the show,
picture.
Right? But the thing is, even watching these two first episodes, that's kind of all you need to know. Not all you need to know about the show, but it even fails to capture the tone of these two first episodes. That's how far off it was. Anyways.
No, I remember literally being so mad, and I don't know if it was on Tumblr or on Facebook or some place where I had to comment. The first book or the first, chapter, whatever you want to call it, the first season of the series is literally like a grocery list of things. And like as a filmmaker, when you have that grocery list, you have specific points that anchor the story.
Yeah.
And it's built in already within these first 2 episodes. At the end of episode 2, they outline what they're supposed to do. Somehow, with this perfectly plotted thing, he manages to lose the plot.
Literally lose the plot.
So yeah.
That's a whole nother
That's
episode.
a whole episode of just shit talking about that god awful
You
movie.
could make a whole podcast about how bad
no.
that movie is. Anyway.
But hopefully Netflix has the original creators attached to it, and it's gonna be really interesting to see what they do. I'm trying not to get my hopes up, but it would be interesting if they fleshed out more ideas that they couldn't. Hopefully, we will see more Asian representation in the show
Seconded.
and better CGI. All right, let's get started. So the pilot episode starts out with the iconic Avatar: The Last Airbender opening, with Katara narrating over it. And I don't know if it's like a Nickelodeon thing. I mean, if you look at SpongeBob and Danny Phantom, like they narratively sing through the opening.
The Danny Phantom rap?
Yeah.
Yeah, and even the SpongeBob song.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's like that's how it was in the 2000s with Nickelodeon, where it was like a thing to do that.
Gosh, even Fairly Odd Parents was like made by the same guy. too,
Yeah.
but it's like summary of the show. and
Yeah.
the song.
Like kids could just start in the middle of a season and pick up.
Yeah.
But
I never noticed that.
but Katara doesn't say no. She's very serious.
But would it be better if she sang it?
No, that would be a completely different tone of the whole show. But anyways, this is the first opening that we all have grown to love and memorize. I think it's great because I find it like an icing on top of a cake, where if your intro is captivating and cool enough to like watch and not skip, because Netflix spoils us. There's like an option to skip. Netflix and Hulu and all of the streams give you that option now. But I really don't mind watching the intro for the show because it's just so good.
Yeah. I think the music too has a lot to do with it, right?
Yeah.
Like I just noticed there's a lot of musical cues in it, but with the intro, it's so inspiring and uplifting that you want to hear it, and it builds up, and it does create the hope that Katara is talking about.
I think length also has a lot to do with it compared to like bringing up Netflix shows now, right? Most intros for shows now are like 2 minutes long, a minute long now. And it doesn't sound like that long, but it's like, it takes a while, right? You know, the True Detective intro is like a whole thing. In here, it's not as long, it flows better, but it still does the job of like getting you into the mood. Avatar, because again, like going back to like the musical cues, hearing that, it's like, ooh, yeah, this is Avatar time.
And the ad-libs too.
And it's interesting because they don't use this as the opening credits. You don't see any names. It's just it focuses you on the plot. And this is the goal.
True.
And it's crazy how we've been watching this MacGuffin of they need to defeat the Fire Lord for like what the show is 5 years old, 2003 to 2008. So you know and have followed this MacGuffin for 5 years, and still the show delivered in the series finale. And that's crazy. And you're reminded every time you start an episode. So Katara gives us a little bit of backstory of what's happened in her world. She tells us that her grandmother would tell her stories of a time of peace in their land when the Avatar kept the 4 nations in balance, but that all changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Only the Avatar, master of all 4 elements, could stop them. Only he can stop the Firebenders, but when the world needed him most, he vanished. 100 years pass, and the Fire Nation is nearing victory in the war. 2 years ago, Katara's dad, along with all the men in her village, left to go fight in this war, and left Katara and Sokka to look after the tribe. Katara then tells us that some people believe that the Avatar was never reborn into the air nomads, and that the cycle is broken. But Katara hasn't lost hope. Katara believes that the Avatar will come back, and the Avatar will return to save the world. Dun, 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 dun. We start off with a bird's eye view of the camera flying over the Arctic. It's quiet, cold, and still. We see large masses of ice somewhere in the ocean, and in between them, a small boat carrying 2 passengers. The camera gets closer. We see Sokka holding a spear over the water. He tells Katara to watch him as he catches a fish, but Katara wants to catch a fish using her own method. Waterbending! After double checking to make sure Sokka's not looking, she pulls off her glove and starts swaying her hands back and forth in a circular motion. A fish rises to the surface in a water bubble, and Katara yells in excitement, "Sokka, look!" Without looking over his shoulder, Sokka shushes Katara so that he can focus on catching fish. We cut to a long shot of Sokka Katara in the boat. As Sokka raises his spear to throw it at a fish, he pops Katara's water bubble and gets drenched in water. The two get in a fight. Sokka calls it magic water. Katara corrects him and says it's water bending. They start bickering, but the water currents pick up, and they're soon rushed down a dangerous stream. As they weave through the icebergs along the path, their boats get smashed by large chunks of ice, and the two end up marooned on one of the ice pieces. Sokka immediately blames Katara for the accident by saying, "Leave it to a girl to screw things up." Katara calls Sokka sexist and starts telling him off. As she waves her arms around in anger, she shatters a tall iceberg behind her. A huge sphere of glowing ice emerges from the water, and the shadow of Aang and Appa are seen from inside. Katara sees Aang's eyes open and rushes towards the ice to break it. The sphere shatters, causing a beam of light to shoot up into the sky. Zuko and Uncle Iroh spot the beam from far away. Zuko gets excited, but Uncle Iroh says to not get his hopes up. Zuko tells Uncle Iroh that he needs to capture the Avatar, and they start sailing towards the light.
Was that a recap of like the first
5 minutes. Yeah.
So much
much
happened.
We have so much to unpack. Okay, first of all, Sokka's an asshole. He really is. In the beginning, he's really sexist and conservative and mean to Katara.
In watching that and in hearing the recap, I had misremembered and thought that the men of the Water Tribe had left a long time ago, like when Katara and Sokka were really young.
Yeah.
But in rewatching the intro, Katara says it was just 2 years ago. And that's really interesting to me because Katara is probably 12, maybe the same age as Aang, and Sokka's probably like a year or two older than Katara, right? So the reasoning would probably be why Sokka was left behind was because he just missed the age of like being of age to go to war, right?
Yeah.
And that's really sad. But that leaves him with the task of being the eldest boy and the only man, because if 2 years had passed, he's now, past some right or is now a man. Or later in the series, we'll find out. You have to go through like a rite or whatever to actually become a man. But anyways, all that to say, I think Sokka has this burden of masculinity and this burden of having to be this pillar of strength. And as a young boy and with no role model, that's really difficult for him to do. So I think he lashes out at any moment of femininity or any moment of weakness because he sees himself in that. And that's so sad that it comes out in that way.
Yeah, you definitely see gender roles taking apart in these 2 episodes. I love how the creators and the screenwriters basically put their foot down and they use the word sexist in the dialogue. When Katara calls out Sokka and says, "You are sexist, I'm not going to stand for it," it definitely puts the tone for the rest of the show, and I freaking love it.
Yeah.
I was joking with you the other day when we were talking about this, about how so it's basically what wakes the Avatar up is misogyny, right? And as a joke, right? But in watching the episode, I was talking to Joanna about it, it's actually not misogyny that wakes the Avatar up. It's actually Katara putting her foot down and standing up to misogyny. That's what wakes him up. Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I had pointed that out, and that was interesting that you, of course, see that misogyny is what breaks the ice, right? But it's Katara literally standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to hear it. I'm going to break this cycle of misogyny, of sexism between you and I right now. And in doing that, she's going to bring change about. It's more than just the ice breaking apart that does it, but her willingness to continue and actually literally break the ice and open that up. I don't know, symbolism there.
literal symbolism. I love it when she's yelling at him and she's like, I'm sick of doing your dirty laundry. You can wash your own clothes. I'm like, wow, the gender roles are established. And I don't know if they meant to do that, but like in Asian culture, gender roles are really, really established in Asian culture. And to not be a part of this gender role, you kind of get looked down upon in the Asian community, especially like in my family. All the women are, there's standards. Like if you don't know how to cook and clean, if you don't do it for the guys, you get looked down upon. Like you're lazy, you're not a good wife or daughter. There are definitely like these roles that these characters have and that are put on them. And we see, even in the first episode, like they are breaking these roles. Later down the line, you see Katara, she wants to take care of her people too. And she wants to fight. It's not just the men's job to fight.
She literally wants to bring the bacon home too, because you see that like Sokka's like, men are the hunters. And Katara's like, no, I can actually do this myself.
Yeah.
With the fish is really interesting. And Katara, it's so heartbreaking because she says like ever since mom died.
Aww.
And that was like probably more than 2 years ago.
Aww.
So it kind of just sheds light on the fact that Katara has had to grow up far quicker than Sokka, because ever since their mom died, she had to pick up the traditional roles, which was to take care, to do the cooking, to do the washing and the cleaning, while Sokka, she says, is playing soldier. And that's so sad because you'll see later on in the episode, all that playing soldier didn't really help at all.
It doesn't help, but it's still not to discount, like it's playing soldier, but it's also, we were talking about earlier, like it's still really sad because it's just a general misunderstanding between the two of them, brother and sister, which they rectify later on. We have to remember also that like Sokka is under a lot of pressure. Like he is like, we'll get to it later, being the only quote air quotes man there. Yeah, he's the only one. Like if the Fire Nation were to arrive, he'd be the only one.
Yeah, that would be literally able to do something. But when I say like playing soldier didn't really help at all, what I mean to say is when you look at it, I don't want to say logistically, but realistically, if he was the strongest soldier in all of the Water Tribe, would not be able to hold off an entire fire navy. So my critique is not that he isn't strong enough or that he isn't upholding masculinity to the highest or whatever, but it's more that he doesn't understand that playing soldier or going the militaristic route and fighting is the only way that you can save your village.
And then we also get, in these first 5 minutes, a lot of things are established. We see Katara waterbending. We see waterbending for the first time. We see Zuko's mission and Uncle Iroh's hesitation towards not being a mentor, but also he wants to guide Zuko, but at the same time, he knows that Zuko kind of has an impossible task. In a way, he's like sheltering Zuko by like saying, don't get your hopes up. But Zuko's like, fuck that, let's sail to the light. And then you do see Zuko's ambition to achieve his honor back.
I've never heard that before.
I do like also how, I think it's interesting that the first two characters of the Fire Nation who talk are Zuko and Uncle Iroh. And while Zuko is the quintessential, what you would expect to be the villain, Uncle Iroh is kind of the opposite. He's like chill, he's like playing like
some weird solitaire game.
And he's just like, just chill out, man, have some tea. And it's like, and from the get-go, it like subverts this expectation
the
of
monolith
yeah
that people have of the Fire Nation.
Yeah,
for sure.
Immediately. And like later on we find out that even Zuko isn't what we think he is. Even in this mythos, like the Fire Nation isn't,
there are multitudes.
Yeah, and then we definitely get the tonality of the show too. Like Sokka is really sarcastic, but he's also insultingly sarcastic.
Yes.
There's always like a little bit of jab of truth in his sarcasm, and he does provoke a sense of emotions out of all the people that he messes with. It could be his way of projecting his insecurities and his way of coping with the realization that they are in a war. But also Uncle Iroh, yeah, he is like the greatest balance towards Zuko. What I feel like was missing from the live adaptation movie was Uncle Iroh's humor. And without that, I realized that Prince Zuko comes off really annoying and angsty. And Uncle Iroh's humor and lightheartedness definitely balances it out. And so we don't take Zuko's moodiness too seriously.
Yeah, there's a severity to it that tames that makes it more palatable and more understanding, because when you see somebody so passionate about that, you can't help but like feel strongly too. But then when you get Uncle Iroh like chase, you're like, oh, okay, he's still a kid, he still doesn't really know what he wants to do. It's a more watered down version of it that allows people to, or at least for me, to understand that like what he is about to take on might be a little bit too much for him.
Yeah. And I feel like, I don't know, I think I tend to not really like the era of teenage years, like in movies or in TV shows, because we've all experienced it and we all want to move on. But if done right, it's fine. But with Zuko, I feel like half of the things he says is so eye-rolling that Uncle Iroh, in his humor, eye-rolls for us and makes fun of Zuko for us. Like what Anthony said, like, dude, chill. There's more to life than this path that you're on. So good. Uncle Iroh's so good.
Yeah. Towards the future. Like the balance between the two and how like Zuko's always tugging here this way to like, you know, to meet the expectations of his father or whatever. And then Iroh's always like, oh, this way. It's left. It's, you know, I don't know. Like later on. Anyways.
Later. All right, let's continue. Back to the iceberg. Sokka shields Katara from danger as Aang rises from the iceberg, his arrow and eyes glowing. The glowing stops, and Aang collapses right into Katara's arms. Sokka pokes at Aang's head with the back of his spear, and Katara yells at him to stop. Aang wakes up and sees Katara. He asks her to come closer, and as she gets closer, he asks her, "Will you go penguin sledding with me?" "Sure," Katara replies. Sokka starts asking Aang a bunch of questions, but Aang doesn't know how to answer them. So we hear a loud grumble, and Aang takes off and hugs this huge pile of fur. And then we discover that this huge fur is Appa. Aang tells the gang that Appa is his flying bison, and Sokka's like, right, this is my flying sister Katara. And oh my god, his humor is so great. Sokka doesn't believe him, and Appa retaliates by sneezing on him. I feel like karma is so strong towards Sokka. Like, anything he does, it just backfires. And he just takes it. Aang asks if they live nearby, and Sokka gets defensive. He suspects that Aang is probably working for the Fire Nation, and that the beam of light earlier was Aang sending a signal to the Fire Navy. Katara doesn't believe this and starts introducing himself and Sokka. As Aang introduces himself, he sneezes and flies 10 feet in the air. Katara realizes that Aang is an airbender, but Sokka doesn't believe it either. He tries to walk back towards the village, but realizes that he's still marooned in the middle of nowhere. Aang tells him that Appa can fly them back. Aang tries to get Appa to fly, but he's too tired. Sokka is still skeptical of Appa's flying abilities, but Aang reassures him that he'll see Appa fly soon enough. There's a great line where Katara says, "Why are you smiling at me like that?" And then Aang replies back, "Oh, I was smiling?" And Sokka just rolls his eyes. It's just so great. Like, immediately you see Aang, like, infatuated with Katara. Their relationship you see grow, like, the whole series. We cut to Zuko's ship. Uncle Iroh goes to the ship deck and tells Zuko to get some sleep. He then tells Zuko that he will never find the Avatar. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather weren't able to find him. Zuko replies back with how their honor wasn't at stake, and that is why he will be successful. We cut back to a long shot of the gang on Appa swimming through the ocean. Katara asks Aang if he has any idea what happened to the Avatar. Aang replies back that he didn't know the Avatar. Katara bids goodnight, and Aang looks away with guilt written all over his face. We get a flashback of how Aang got stuck in the South Pole. The color palette is now sepia, and Aang is caught in a dangerous storm. We see him scream as he and Appa crash into the water. Aang becomes unconscious and drifts away from Appa's reins. But just as he loses it, he goes into the Avatar state. Aang forms a huge glowing sphere around him and Appa, freezing them in place. And just as the ice hardens, Aang wakes up and realizes he's back in the village. As he's getting dressed, Katara catches a glimpse of Aang's tattoos and lets out a huge gasp. Oh my god!
Again, they managed to pack in a lot in these first 2 episodes.
We see airbending for the first time.
All right. I do like how he says, yeah, you just sneezed and you jumped 10 feet high or whatever, right? And Aang's like, oh, it felt higher than that. That was hilarious.
Yeah, I remember watching that for the first time, and I would think he would say like, oh, did I really? As if to like hide that. But he goes like, no, I'm pretty sure it was more than 10
Aang
feet.
is so cocky. Oh my god.
But like...
It's like a modest cockiness.
Yeah, it's like humble brag all the time.
Oh yeah.
Like, is it because he's a monk? Everything that he says as cocky doesn't come off as... Because usually that would be like, if he keeps doing it, it's annoying. But it's not. It doesn't.
Yeah, I would think like it's like, oh, maybe it's because he's the Avatar that he's cocky. But like, I don't think it is. I think he was just born a very like confident young man. His upbringing just kind of shows that even as monks, they had very few inhibitions when it came to expressing yourself.
Oh.
And that's so refreshing to see alongside Sokka and Katara, who very much censor themselves to appear like grown-ups to the rest of the village.
And you definitely get a sense of lightheartedness coming from Aang too. And he sets the tone in the series where it's weird. They're all, when one of them is serious, the other is lighthearted, and so on and so forth. Like, Sokka's always joking when Katara's trying to be serious. And then when Sokka's trying to be serious about the war, Aang is joking. And Katara, like, it's so good.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting.
The balance.
The three of them play off of each other. So, like, the energy doesn't ever get too in one place.
And when it does, when the tone does get serious, you know shit's about to happen.
Yeah.
And you hear the music and you're like, oh crap. But yeah, can we talk about Appa? Oh my gosh.
Appa's so cute. And like, we know he's a giant flying bison, but when we're introduced here, like, I just imagine what it's like to be Sokka or Katara and then to see this gigantic thing in the water that you've like, the biggest thing you've probably seen is like a seal or something, right? To see that giant thing. Oh my gosh, like how crazy.
And again, humble brag. Like, Aang is like, oh yeah, that's my flying bison. No big deal, you know. He could fly. You want to see? And then when Appa doesn't fly because he's too tired, Sokka is just like really hammering it down. Like, oh really? Yeah. He can fly. And Aang's like, oh, you'll see. You'll fucking see.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. Like, with that though, I know Sokka's being very challenging, right? And that's just kind of his nature, as he challenges people. But I think also, as you were recapping, the fact that he was like, to Katara, don't tell him that. When Aang asks, like, oh, do you guys live near here? I just, again, am reminded of how hyper-vigilant Sokka has had to be for his entire village. And everybody takes that like, oh, he's just being silly, or he's just being too, like, he's taking himself too seriously, right? But that hyper-vigilance, I feel like he's the only one really, like, looking out for them. And then you see that later, too. And again, I feel like I'm kind of going back and forth with how I feel about Sokka playing soldier. But Sokka being hyper-vigilant, like preparing for what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
He's the only one doing something.
Yeah. And you see how sheltered Aang is too. Like, he doesn't think about it. Like, how he doesn't think about, like, the socio-political nature of them not wanting to reveal where they are, because he's been sheltered his whole life. The community that raised him are monks, and he trusts them. He trusts his community. And you can't, like, Katara and Sokka, like, they could say the same about the Water Tribe, but Aang hasn't had that experience of invasion and war.
privilege.
Oh, fuck. Aang is privileged.
And like as an air nomad, right, and as a monk, he expects to be welcomed wherever he goes. So to feel that kind of like apprehensive nature from Sokka, not so much Katara, because Katara's like, oh my god, like,
Yeah.
you guys, I found an airbender, is new to Aang, and he doesn't really know how to process that other than like, let me just be more chipper then.
Let me just turn it up to 11.
It's interesting because Uncle Iroh, we call it like embedded dialogue, where in film they include information like naturally in a conversation. So Uncle Iroh is like, dude, your whole family for generations has tried to find the Avatar and have failed. And again, it goes back to Uncle Iroh's so cool, but at the same time, he's just trying to protect Zuko from heartbreak and from this impossible task that he has. But Zuko is still dedicated, super ambitious. I mean, at this point, it's the first episode, we don't know why it's taken everyone so long to find the Avatar. And then you find out later in the series. But you do get a sense of, like, dramatic irony, because for those of you that are listening, dramatic irony is when, like, the audience knows something, but the characters in the show doesn't. You can see it in horror movies, like where you see the bad guy in the background, and you're just like, oh, shit. Oh, things are about to go down. You get a sense of dramatic irony here when Katara asks Aang, like, oh, have you seen the Avatar? Do you know him? And Aang knows that he's the Avatar. And we know that he's the Avatar because of, like, all the commercials, and he's, like, the Avatar, the Last Airbender. There is, like, this mystery of, like, what's going on here.
Can we also talk about, going back to Uncle Iroh, how, like, his pursuit versus Uncle Iroh's attitude is kind of like the duality of like two different kinds of masculinity in terms of, because with Zuko, right, like he has Zuko's father rather, like it presents him two paths later on, this very toxic hyper masculinity versus like this like nurturing masculinity that Uncle Iroh has. And like again, like I just really like how these first two episodes like just introduced that already.
Yeah, so good.
Like, when I see Uncle Iroh in these first two episodes, it's clear that Uncle Iroh wants to steer Zuko away from the path of finding the Avatar, because finding the Avatar to Uncle Iroh means finding favor again with his father, who's going to lead Zuko down a greater path.
Yeah.
So, like, when watching it, I'm just kind of like, if you really cared for your nephew, like, you would think you would help him, right? But he flat out like doesn't care. He's like asleep, or he's just like playing solitaire, eating roast duck. And like, if you didn't know, like if you didn't watch, you know, the rest of the series, you just think like this guy doesn't care about his nephew at all. But when you see his greater goal and what the Avatar means, not just to the world but to the family in particular, and to Zuko's upbringing and his like reason for existence, like you just come to appreciate Uncle Iroh and how he navigates that.
Can we also talk about Aang's instant infatuation with Katara? Like the first shot of him seeing her is just like this close-up of her face, and we see that later in the series where they do flashback at that, and then later you see the animation changing whenever there is a male gaze through like Aang's perspective on how he views Katara, and it's interesting. Like it plays into account here. Like we definitely see Aang does have like instant feelings towards Katara, and it could be just like a little boy crush. I don't know. And it's weird because Katara's infatuation isn't romantic at first. It's more like curiosity, because she has been sheltered in the South Pole for so long, and then when she sees Aang's tattoos for the first time, she gasps and she's like, oh.
Exactly.
In a sense, I think maybe part of their initial interaction is the fact that they're both curious about each other, right? Because again, coming from being a monk, and it's obvious that he's never been to the South Pole, right? Like even as a traveling band, right?
I'm not sure about that.
You don't think so?
I think he's been to the South Pole before.
That's why he's like, oh, let's go penguins.
Yeah, like he knows instantly. He sees their clothes
Right,
and
okay.
knows where he is. Like he knows this is a place where I go penguin sledding.
This is where I can, yeah.
But I think still he is curious because if you're traveling from place to place, right, you don't get to spend that much time with people. So that's why he's so open and curious about meeting a different waterbender at least. So I think that's still valid that their initial meeting is, how would you say it?
Meet cute.
I mean...
Wait, what'd you say?
Meet cute.
It's meet cute.
But like,
What's that?
not really.
Meet cute is, how would you describe it? During like in rom-coms, it's usually like you're like at the cafe and then somebody drops something and you both reach for it and you look up, kind of that kind of thing.
Oh.
Like, you know,
Yeah.
but it's like the most
Cute.
like not dramatic meet cute, but it's the most like
Trope.
world changing meet cute.
Yells at brother, accidentally bumps into giant iceberg.
Unleashes Avatar.
Who would have thought?
I do like how his first thought is, "Do you want to go penguins?"
Yeah.
He's such a child.
He
The
is.
best wing.
And Katara says that later. Aang has brought something to the village that we haven't had for a while, which is fun. And like Marilyn brought that up earlier, where Aang symbolizes and like encapsulates a lot of hope and happiness and frivolity. I think that the village desperately needs, but didn't know that they needed, right? Because they've been living without that for so long.
Yeah.
And they see it as a necessity. But with what you were saying earlier about Aang's instant infatuation with Katara, I just think that's so cute. How he's like, oh, I didn't realize I was smiling. And it's so earnest. Like, it's not a, like, oh, was I? Like, you know?
Yeah. So innocent. Like, he's so pure. Aang is so pure. And it does reflect, like, his ignorance and, as we mentioned earlier, a sense of privilege where he is like this form of purity that hasn't been corrupted yet by the knowledge of what's been happening with the war. And then you see how that changes him later. And yeah, and his growth, it's just so, his growth is so big.
Yeah. And like, I think it's interesting how his awareness of the war and the magnitude of what he basically did by running away from his responsibilities happens first before his self-awareness as a person.
Yeah.
Where he still is unsure of what he's doing. Like, he still doesn't understand that he's infatuated with Katara, and he has to grow up in a different sense first.
Priorities, like all of them grow up faster than they can.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
he's not even aware of like why he feels that way yet, but he's aware of this huge task that he has to take on and aware of like this guilt, right, that he faces, and he doesn't really understand how to process that yet.
Yeah. It is interesting to look at Aang's personality to begin with. Like, his last memory is almost dying and crashing into the ocean, and his avatar state instinct kicks in, and that's the last thing he remembers. For any normal person, that would be so traumatizing, but literally, like, the next time he opens his eyes is him seeing Katara's face and asking her, like, hey, do you want to hang out with me? Like, let's go find a penguin. And that's just, like, so
Inspiring. And I don't know, I really appreciate that about Aang, but you can also say that it's so repressed.
yeah.
You know, he pushes that way back into his mind, and you can even say that before he goes into the avatar state, his mind goes blank in a sense, because he's just running away. He's just like, I have to get away, and he doesn't remember doing that really.
Yeah.
So when he comes back and wakes up, he's himself rather than this thing that he's trying to get away from.
Yeah.
So I can see what you mean, but I think repression has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, knowing now what we know, like, it's him, it's kind of like a deflection, right? Where, like, he goes towards fun because he doesn't want to think about all the weight that's on him. And that's how he got in that whole situation to begin with, is because he was trying to not think about what he has to do. Yeah, I agree with you. And it's like, I don't know, and it's just a reminder that like all three of them, like they're just kids and they have so much weight.
Yeah.
On their shoulders.
4 of them.
And you kind of see his personality reflecting in his airbending too. Like way down the line, you see how his evasiveness and his personality when it comes to like traumatic things or responsibilities plays into effect when he's fighting. And maybe it's the way he's been raised, like airbenders. They don't meddle with politics. They evade.
No, yeah, that's really great to bring up in his fighting style, is that airbenders are kind of more reactionary, and the whole evasiveness you see later on in the episode for sure, or in the next episode, I guess. But the fact that I'm not going to instigate. I'm not going to do something unless it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And I want to just point out that I'm super ignorant when it comes to like monastic life, like how monks live and all that stuff. And I'm aware that there's not one idea of a monk, but I think that idea of not doing harm to others is fairly universal. And I think Aang struggles with that, and you can see that immediately, even though we don't really understand where he comes from yet. But you can tell he doesn't want to harm somebody who's literally trying to kill him.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful to me, that he's just like, well, I'm just gonna run away. Like, I don't actually want to hurt you. I'm just gonna run away.
Like, I don't know, I know we're not supposed to, but like in Korra in season 3 or 2, the bad guy, the airbender guy, and how he uses his airbending, how it's the exact opposite of Aang. And like where like you could see, like you were pointing out, like a lot of Aang's nature is reflected in how he bends. A lot of that other guy's name, insert name here, and like
a man who can fly.
Yeah.
All of our listeners hate us now that we don't know this.
But
cut this out.
It's interesting to see, like, you think before then, like, we only see one kind of airbending, and it's like the monks, right? And then how he uses airbending is completely different, and it's very violent, right? And it's interesting, like, looking back retrospectively, like how different the two are, and how bending really is representative of how, like, it is an expression of that person.
And you get a taste for how powerful bending can be. Like, Aang sneezes and he flies. Like, if he was in this house with us, he would break our roof or just cause so much damage. And it does make sense later where we see, like, these monks and these airbenders, when they do go off to train, they are in the mountains where they can not have limitations, like physical limitations, spiritual limitations.
Oh man, I like want to point out, like when you talk about, you can just cut this out, but I just want to say it. But when you talk about like airbending and how the monks lived, and they live in this open space and they're able to use airbending in this like flowing way, and you see this man who's probably been in prison more than a couple of times, right? Who's probably lived in the city where everything is so confined. His airbending has taken a different form because the environment that you're placed in definitely alters how you use the resources and the skills that you have. I don't know, that's really interesting.
And how Milo bends and he uses fart bending.
Oh, yeah. I also want to talk about, let's talk about the flashback. I don't know all of the episodes by heart, but is it the case where every flashback is like in this sepia palette, just like the conscious choice of the animators to do so that we know, and maybe like the little kids that are watching knows, like this is a flashback. And we also see the Avatar state for the first time, and holy shit, so many questions, like is it instinctive, only for emergencies? And then later you find out that Aang can
trigger it. Yeah, from what I recall, yes, stylistically when they do flashback, it is a different color to indicate that. When you look at something through sepia tone, it's nostalgia almost, right?
Oh.
And you're looking at it with a more familiar and warm tone, and you're looking at it favorably. But then I think back to the flashbacks that like Katara has as a kid with her mom. All the flashbacks they tend to show us end up being really traumatic moments. And I think that juxtaposes with what we consider when we think of sepia tone, right? And when we think of nostalgia and looking back, we think of fond moments. But these flashbacks tend to be, again, I think really traumatic moments that inform the characters that we see.
Yeah. That reminds me of what I go through whenever I smell incense. Because because I was raised Buddhist, and in Theravada Buddhism, I associate incense with death. Because whenever we do have a funeral, or whenever we do hold like a gathering of some sort to honor the dead, we use incense. And so it is jarring later when I see like in Western culture where they associate incense with like, oh, it smells good. Oh, like...
Oh yeah, I blew up this broom. Like,
Yeah.
I need to light some incense.
A bunch of cultural appropriation with incense where I can't help but feel sad and triggered by like the smell of it, but at the same time, like, it means something different to me and to my community. And I can't say this about like other people that were raised in Theravada Buddhism, but that's like, I associate incense with death, and so it's not a good association.
Yeah.
And then with the sepia tone, we do get a sense of what you were saying, how it deceivingly looks warm, but it is like a very serious moment for these characters and what they've gone through. And that warm tone maybe balances out like the seriousness of their traumatic memories and how it plays into effect of like how they live their life. But yeah, that's all the time that we have for this episode. I couldn't fit everything into one episode for The Boy in the Iceberg, so I made it into 2 parts. Go ahead and check out the next part, and we'll see you soon.